Hi, everyone, and welcome to Diversity in Clinical Trials Healthcare Disparities. I'm Alexandra Bacchus, and I'm part of the New Lab team. Many of you might be familiar with our work at New Lab, but others may be encountering our work for the first time today. Thanks for joining us. For those of you not familiar with New Lab, we are a community of experts and innovators applying a transformative technology to solve the world's biggest challenges. Through our membership in studios, we bring together entrepreneurs, engineers, inventors, and industry leaders to create sustainable solutions and enterprises. And we employ technologies, including robotics, AI, and material science to transform what matters most: health, environment, media, cities, and infrastructure. This series is presented by Johnson & Johnson Innovation, JLabs, and New Lab. The series is focused on diversity, equity, and inclusion in healthcare and clinical trials. Our panelists are looking to field questions from the audience, so to ask a question, please type it out in the Q&A button and we'll help get those in front of our panelists. Without further ado, I'm happy to introduce Sean Evans from Johnson & Johnson Innovation, JJDC, the strategic investment arm of Johnson & Johnson. Over to you, Sean.
Thank you, Alexandra, for that kind introduction. I'd also like to thank our partners at New Lab for co-organizing this event with us, and to the great panelist lineup in advance for their insights on this very, very important topic. As Alexandra mentioned, my name is Sean Evans, and I sit within our Johnson & Johnson Innovation Strategic Investment Group. At J&J Innovations, our mission is to look for the world's most promising early stage healthcare innovation wherever it originates. And through our global network, we provide regional points of entry for life science and health technology innovators to engage with us in J&J's sector interests in therapeutics, medical devices, and consumer health. As part of our mission, diversity and health equity are a critical area and key consideration in supporting new innovations. I believe we here at J&J and the biotech space at large have made significant strides in this area, but work must continue to ensure that new healthcare innovations are effective for everyone and accessible to everyone. Again, we are very excited to collaborate with New Lab on this event series and to discuss this really important topic. At J&J and J&J Innovation, we value diversity in all its dimensions, and we passionately are committed to helping improve health equity through innovation. So thank you, and I'll turn it back over to you, Alexandra.
Great. So I'm now happy to introduce Kimberly Tableman, who's the Chief Clinical Development Officer at Castor, who will be moderating our discussion. Really excited to kick this off.
Thank you, Alexandra. And I am excited today to be able to introduce our esteemed colleagues and panelists who are going to be discussing healthcare disparities and also what we can do both as individuals and as an industry to essentially move the needle in this space. So first, I'd like to introduce Dr. Millicent Gorham. She is the Executive Director at the National Black Nurses Association. Thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Gorham. I also would like to introduce Wendy Garvin Mayo. She is an Associate Director and Clinical Project Scientist at the Janssen Company. Thank you so much for joining us today, Wendy. Happy to have you here as a panelist. And we also have with us Jordine Blaze. She is the Vice President for Equity and Community at Circuit Clinical, which is a startup who is committed to expanding the infrastructure to improve overall access for all to clinical research. And we also have Lewis Shackelford with us, who is a external relations project manager in the HIV vaccine trials network and COVID-19 prevention network at Fred Hutchinson's. Thank you so much, Lewis, for joining us as well. Very excited to be moderating this panel today, and really just want to start out with a basic foundational question around: how do each of you think about healthcare equity? And I will turn it over, Jordine, to you.
Thank you, Kimberly. My framework for healthcare equity is really connected to the social determinants of health. And I think that it's beyond a visit to a doctor's office, and it really is looking holistically at people's access to workforce development, access to consistent and critical care, whether that be primary care, as well as emergency services. It also exists in the social and built environment. And more broadly, it is access to care that is tailored and framed with them in mind, whomever they are and whatever bodies they navigate the system in.
Thank you, Jordine. Dr. Gorham, what are your thoughts about healthcare equity?
Thank you so much for having me, Kimberly. I really appreciate it. So healthcare equity from a lens of the National Black Nurses Association is all about access to healthcare, quality, culturally competent healthcare. And we want to make sure that nurses are considered as part of that healthcare team, particularly when we're talking about preventive healthcare and getting access to healthcare for everybody, for whatever stage you're in, whether it's racial, ethnic, sexual orientation, disability, whatever place that you find yourself. We want to make sure that everyone has access to the appropriate culturally competent care.
Thank you, Dr. Gorham. Lewis, would love to hear your thoughts on healthcare equity and what it means to you.
Thank you. And I agree with my fellow panelists. Healthcare needs to be equitable in that it's rolled out to people in a way that's culturally relevant and accessible. But one thing I would like to add is that I think we also need to think about who's the providers that are giving this healthcare. You know, we need to make sure that there are providers who look like the people and have not just have some cultural relevancy training, but also, you know, maybe are from that culture. I mean, that's something that we don't talk about enough, is that there are pipelines, there are hurdles for people getting into healthcare, especially people of color. And we need to overcome those hurdles if we're going to talk about equity in healthcare, because a lot of our populations that are in need of healthcare are populations that trust people who look like them the most.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Lewis, for that perspective. And Wendy, looking forward to your thoughts on healthcare equity as well.
Yes, so I agree with everything that was said. So health equity in my mind is for individuals, regardless of race, social economic status, has the potential to reach their optimal health. And I think we need to take a holistic approach to it, like what Jordine was saying. So it starts before, you know, we talk about healthcare, but even looking at access to healthy neighborhoods, access to healthy foods, access to good healthcare, good education. So it has to be a holistic approach in order for people to reach their full health potential. I know we talk about health, but before we get there, how do we institute policies that help individuals, minority individuals, or people who are underrepresented, you know, to live a healthy life before they even enter the healthcare system?
Yeah, thank you very much, Wendy, for that. And one of the things I just want to share with our participants as well that are joining us today is this is a second webinar series in a two-part series. And we did start talking initially in June about just overall trust and access. And part of the conversation is around diversity in clinical research. And so we tend to have a lot of conversations about this idea that we do not have enough diversity in our clinical trials. And the reason we wanted to focus on healthcare equity, trust, and access is exactly, Wendy, to your point, when does that start? And what I mean by that is, when do we start addressing this issue and building those relationships? And I would submit that it's not ideal to start thinking about these things at the point that you want to recruit individuals into a clinical trial, because at that point, there may not be a good overall awareness. There may not be a comfort level, again, going back to that longer term relationship and how we're building trust. So the second question that I wanted to pose to the panel today is for you each to share your thoughts and reflections on, when should we as people and also as an industry be thinking about healthcare equity? And I know each of you has a really unique perspective on that. So I'd love to hear, how each of you feel about the kind of starting point for health equity. And I think if it's okay, Wendy, I'm gonna start with you.
Yeah, so health equity needs to start now. It should always be top of mind for anything we are doing, especially being in America, right? Based our foundation on racism and disparities across the board. But we should always be thinking about it. Even I think of the disparities in maternal health, the mortality of infants. Our children are disadvantaged, right? Infants, innocent children coming into this world, and then infants were being born into inequities and discrimination and racism. So it should be top of mind when we're thinking about anything in terms of health, in terms of clinical trials, in terms of access. We should always be talking about it. So it should always be on the agenda.
Thank you so much for that. Dr. Gorham, what are your thoughts on that in terms of when do we need to start?
Yesterday.
Right.
So yeah. So let me just put it into perspective from the nursing point of view. Our president, Dr. Martha Dawson, believes that if we're going to have the kind of workforce that we're going to need in order to recruit and retain patients in clinical trials, that we actually need to start at the grade school level. So she started a mini nurse academy, and the mini nurse academy is from the 3rd grade through the 6th grade, bringing nurses into those to those elementary schools, having them to have conversations with the students about nursing and what nursing really looks like, and then taking them through their paces in terms of projects that kids could do around nursing. And then they end up with a pinning ceremony and a white coat, and they end up with a stethoscope around their necks, because this is where, from what we understand, what the literature says to us is that in elementary school, this is when kids begin to formulate the ideas of what they want to be when they grow up. And so what we want them to be when they grow up are nurses and other kinds of healthcare providers and leaders leaders who are in the boardroom, who are going to help us get to the next level in terms of providing the quality care that we all are expected to have throughout the continuum of our lives. And so that begins in elementary school. And then we'll take that pace right on through. And I have some more ideas after that.
All right. Thank you so much for that. And Jordine, what are your thoughts in terms of when does health equity start?
Yeah, I want to underscore both today and yesterday and offer a different perspective of time. Because, my background is on the drug development and pharmaceutical industry side, right? And so now at an integrated research organization, I would say it needs to start at inception. And what I mean by that is yesterday, absolutely, today, absolutely. But from the moment we look in a microscope and we see a grouping of cells and say, there's a problem I want to solve, right? I think it's required to step outside of the microscope and look holistically at the world, right, that interacts with that problem. And so what I mean by that is when we are developing clinical trials, and I'm really, really heavy on this, there's a lot of conversation about diversifying our patient populations, but that just doesn't happen with like a snap of a finger, right? In order to diversify the patient populations, we need to diversify the areas where we're conducting our trials, right? We need to expand that. We need to expand the people who are involved in the pipeline of drug development, from the people who are developing, the scientists, right, who are developing the research, to our nurses and other healthcare professionals, right? So that when we say that, there's a lack of trust in these communities around clinical research, my first question is, okay, well, if we know fundamentally there's a lack of trust. Everything that we do from inception of development of therapies needs to be grounded in gaining trust, right? So when I'm in the microscope, I need to think what in this microscope will gain communities trust. When I'm working with healthcare professionals, I need to be sitting with where can I develop trust with these healthcare professionals working in these communities, and not just a small portion of academic research centers where the majority of our clinical trials are taking place right now.
Thank you, Jordine. Absolutely agreed. And Louis, your thoughts on health kind of equity, and at what point do we really we've got today, yesterday, and at inception. So you got some acts to follow here.
All of that. All of
yeah,
that.
all of it.
All of that for sure. I think my panelists covered it, exceptionally well. We need to start today, yesterday, and tomorrow. We need to continue to form relationships with community. And that's really what I would like to underscore. My background is in community engagement and HIV research specifically. And so one of the things that is near and dear to my heart is building relationships with communities before you start a clinical trial. If you know that this is a population of need, if you know this is a population of interest in your research or whatever medical intervention that you're developing, then you need to not just helicopter in for your research and then helicopter out when you're done, and communities are kind of left wondering what their participation even meant, what they got out of the study. They're questioning, what was the goal of the study, because they don't really see the end result. And so we need to think about how we build long-term relationships with communities so that they have the capacity to meaningfully engage in research, that they're not just passive subjects in research. I use subjects in air quotes because they need to be partners. And if communities are not partners, then and you only see them as research subjects, then that's going to color everything that comes out of this research project. So, and it's not just that we form relationships before research studies begin, but we also need to form plans around how we distribute study results, how we build the capacity for people to understand what are the results of these research studies after they have concluded. And so it's a long-term relationship, it's a long-term partnership, and overall, it leads to better research. And I just want to push back against this notion that if you involve communities in research in meaningful ways, that it somehow takes away from the research that you're doing, that is too time consuming, that people are quote unquote hard to reach. And that we know that that is not true. If you partner with communities, if you make them meaningfully engaged in the research you're doing so that they have a say, you will put up better research, and you will find that communities will be more involved in your studies.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Louis, for that. And I also agree. I want to call out a little bit of progress I've seen in the last week, where there have been some channels where Henrietta Lacks is finally being honored, and it's progress to her contribution really is extraordinarily significant from a clinical research perspective, and as we all know the story, that was not acknowledged, for many years. And so now at least we're seeing that acknowledgement on kind of a global scale. I think I've seen it on CNN and a couple of other channels where that has been recognized and acknowledged. I guess a related question is just top of mind, and you mentioned, Louis, HIV and the work that you're doing in that space. Are there other, disease states or conditions that any of you as panelists feel like disproportionately impact underserved communities? And the reason I ask is because, again, I just wonder if there's an opportunity to make investments in those areas that we know individuals are in underserved communities are disproportionately affected. So I just want to open that up to the panel just in general. Are there other areas that the industry at large should be looking at and making a more concerted and long-term, kind of effort? I'm happy for anybody to take that. Jordine, I was going to say, I saw you nod your head.
Yeah, I can jump in and say, I mean, there are quite a few, right? And I'm hesitant to say anything, there's going to be a disproportionate impact, right? Because we know the impact of bias, right? Medical racism, lack of access to resources that Wendy talked about, where we know that there are folks still living in food deserts without access to healthy foods, right? So anything connected to what we eat, we know that we'll see a disproportionate impact in those populations. In specific disease states, I've worked with companies working in the sickle cell disease in the sickle cell disease space, where sickle cell 97% roughly of that population is Black or Latinx. Multiple myeloma is another therapeutic area that I've worked in, where disproportionate populations are Black. In the multiple myeloma space, there's also overrepresentation of Vietnam era veterans in the multiple myeloma space. And so this is what I think I want to reinforce when we talk about, what's under that microscope. Before we start the inception of research, and I think Lewis talked about this as well, is like, we should just start from a space of, okay, well, this is what I want to research. What communities are adversely impacted? If we just assume from the start, there is one, we don't know which, right? Maybe not, but if we assume that there's an answer out there to that question, that there could be, and we start from there, I think you get at a lot of those solutions that Lewis and Wendy and Dr. Gorham addressed, which is, once we know who those populations are, the relationship and the trust building begins then, not 2 years, 5 years, and sometimes 10 or 15 years down the line, when you have a proof of concept and you're ready to say, let me go out in the community and I want you to trust me to try out this new thing that we've created or developed.
Yeah, absolutely. I was thinking too, even things like diabetes, sometimes can be disproportionately in the African-American communities. And there is so much that we can do. I guess that's kind of what I wanted to highlight as well. We touched on it a little bit, but, things like investing, I like the idea of adopting a city, especially if in urban areas that there's a food shortage. There's opportunities there. There's opportunities to create safe places for people to exercise, which would, again, have an impact. And so these things may not seem like they're straight lines to drug development, but what I would argue is they're straight lines to happy, healthy people and the human race. And that's really what all of us aspire to in the kind of healthcare industry. So I think those were good thoughts. I think Alexandra has a couple of questions from our participants listening today.
Can I just comment on that before?
Yes, please, Lewis. Yeah, and then we'll move to Alexandra. Yeah, of course.
So one of the things that I think is really important for companies to do, especially companies as big as Johnson & Johnson and some of these other pharmaceutical companies, is that they face the communities that may be the most disproportionately impacted by a disease or whatever is plaguing our nation at that time. So one of the more positive programs that I've seen is at Gilead, and I believe Merck has a program like this. It's a community liaison program. Mm-hmm. And these are liaisons that are strategically placed all across the country in different regions. And these people act as liaisons to the community from companies like Gilead and Merck. And it's always been a little bit surprising, to be honest with you, that Johnson & Johnson didn't have a program like this, where these people are just there to do community engagement. They're just there to do community education, build community capacity to understand what these companies do and get familiar with their products and things like that, but also to support the community, to provide funds for events and things that promote clinical research or just medical research in general, or just things that enhance the community. So I often wonder, when we had situations like when the Johnson & Johnson vaccine was going through its ups and downs in our country, what would have been the impact if we would have had people on the ground all across the country that were in communities that were disproportionately impacted by COVID-19 to be there as that liaison, to be there as that voice, so they can come to community forums, so that they can go out and do webinars and events and talks and be there as somebody the community knows and answer their questions to kind of relieve some of the anxieties around what was going on at the time. And, you know, just to come back, I mean, I think Henrietta Lacks was mentioned. And I think Henrietta Lacks is one of those examples of, you know, research going off the rails, inhumane treatment of research, people of color in research. And one thing I always think about is, how do you celebrate people? Because often we come at communities of color through, you know, our risk factors, through our detriments, and there's never any celebration of who we are and what we contribute or what we have to offer. It's always just taking, because we are seen as having disparity. And so, you know, that Henrietta Lacks will always be a wound for that reason, and know she will be acknowledged. And I'm glad that she's being acknowledged.
Yeah.
I think we need to do more than just acknowledge the atrocity that was done to her and her family, but also remember that she is not celebrated like she should. And we need to find ways to celebrate her in the communities like the ones that she comes from, because those are the ones in most need, and those are the ones that we need to reach out to be partners in our research and our medical interventions.
Great points, Louis. Thank you. Thank you very much.
So Kimberly, I can
Alexandra?
jump in with the audience question. We just got a really interesting one that came in. So it's long, I'll do my best to summarize, but essentially asking, do you think how the pandemic has affected clinical research has benefit or hurt population diversity? Because on the one hand, remote monitoring has broadened who we can recruit into our studies, but many participants benefit from the in-person relationships of the nurses and study staff that may be lost when you when you can't go into a clinic.
All right.
So I guess
who wants to
it
take
still
that? Yeah, I
is.
was going to say it's open to any of our panelists to answer.
So I think that the pandemic really helped to shine a light on what's going on in terms of clinical trials. And the COVID trials certainly helped to do that. The National Black Nurses Association was very fortunate that we did work with a couple of companies, including Johnson & Johnson and Pfizer, and getting our nurses out there to help recruit patients into trials. The problem still exists that there were not enough providers that look like us to actually be, and who are working in the communities where the underserved populations are, in order to get them into clinical trials. So we really need to take a look at how we're going to broaden and increase the number of providers of color, both physicians and nurses as clinical trial coordinators, nurses as principal investigators in clinical trials. Let me just go ahead and throw that out right now. Since every time I have a conversation with pharmaceutical companies about nurse practitioners as principal investigators, I get this deafening silence that says that has not been done yet. Well, it's time. It's time. And I think that the pandemic helped us all to realize that if nurse practitioners can provide the preventive healthcare services and go across state lines in order to do that, they can hang out their shingle, then certainly they can be taught, just like you teach physicians how to be principal investigators, you can also teach nurse practitioners. And by saying that, I think you expand the number of clinical trials that you can conduct. Okay, so let's just be honest. There are going to be less physicians in the clinical trial business because they're just going to be retiring. And you have to be able to produce a certain number of physicians, as you will be able to produce a certain number of nurse practitioners. Well, we already have the nurse practitioners out there, and they're young nurse practitioners. And there are practitioners that can be taught how to be principal investigators so that the pharma industry will be able to conduct more clinical trials and conduct them in communities where people of color live. Let's be for real. If you really want to have those trials to go on in our communities, you're going to need to bring the trials to the communities. So let's go to the political side of that. If you're going to, as Lewis has said, if you're going to be good community partners, you're going to have to start now for your clinical trials 3 years from now, 5 years from now.
Right.
And if that means that you're going to have relationships with the political people within your area, with business people within your area, to provide financial stability and sustainable entities that are going to be there through the clinical trial and after the clinical trial has ended. And when you come back to provide the results for the clinical trial and then have another clinical trial later on.
Yeah, and just to reinforce that point, what I really love that each one of you is hitting on is two things: taking action now and dealing with root causes, right? I think too often we're talking about, the way the problem is framed is we need to recruit into a clinical trial, right? And what I hear Dr. Gorham, you're saying as well is, look, you got to start way back here. You got to start, way before you're thinking about that. I think each one of you amplified that point is you have to start building those relationships now, building trust now, because there was another question from our participants as well about what can we do to start building trust. And I think the one thing I hope everyone kind of takes away from the comments thus far is this idea that we start today, or yesterday, but we start now and we start building relationships now. And then that's going to help us as we continue to navigate and really think about healthcare, I think, more holistically, because, clinical research is definitely a care option, but the idea here just altogether is being the tide that raises all boats in terms of people living happy, healthy lives and also having options. Right now, one of the issues is that if the infrastructure isn't there, if the accessibility isn't there, people don't even know that they have options. And that's actually super problematic, because you want to know that you have options, right? So how do we create that infrastructure, communication, education, so that people even have that awareness overall that these options are out there and available to them? Alexandra, any other questions that you want to share from the chat?
Yeah, to the theme of trust, there are a couple of trust questions in here, and this one is quite specific. It's on this attendee is interested in thoughts from the panel on how people who feel very passionately about this topic and really want to support communities, but may not look like the communities we're talking about. What are tangible examples of how they can make those connections and build more trust when they can't relate or don't look like these communities?
So I just want to say that this is an issue, a national issue. So anyone can get involved. It doesn't matter what color, what religion, what socioeconomic status you are, but really knowing get involved in policies at the legislative level. Anyone can do that. And there are so many initiatives going on locally, regionally, nationally, where you can join forces, to get involved, to move the needle on these issues that impact minorities and people who are underrepresented.
Yeah, and I like to frame that out too as just overall allyship, right? So for any community, I think Jordine mentioned early on, not just based on, cultural or ethnic background, but even when we talk about sexual identity, gender identity, you can be allies in all of those spaces and help, kind of lift up those communities. So I think that's a great point. One other question I just want to pose too, and I thought that I really like this question is, are there efforts that any of you see currently that you think, yeah, that's working? Like that's really something that is working well. So I think Lewis already gave an example. I really liked that about the community liaisons and a couple programs that he called out that are doing that. Are there other things that you see that are already working to move the needle?
So yeah, I served on the Georgetown Howard University Center for Clinical and Translational Science. And the beauty of that program was also they were working not only with those two major universities, but also with MedStar Hospital and Washington VA Center. And so they took their research into communities in far southeast Washington, DC. And the beauty of it all was that there was community engagement. So you're pulling together all of those major healthcare entities, but you're also making sure that you're pulling together those community leaders, those thought leaders, the pastors, the business people. And I'm not talking about the big folks, but all of them that all business people that have small businesses within the communities, and pull them together about the research that you want to conduct, and making sure that they're part of the communications plan, make sure that they're part of the roundtable discussions about the kind of research that you want to have in your communities, and then be able to make sure that they're coming into the institutions, you're going into their communities, and then you're bringing them back into the institutions as well, so that they'll have conversations with the researchers, with the physicians, with the nurses about the kind of research that's important in their communities and how they're able to offer that research, and then again be able to bring the results back to the communities. You've got to be able to bring in your political people, the council people, your political folks, to make sure that they're in tune in what's going on, particularly if any of the money ends up having to come out of the tax base of that particular area. So you want to make sure everybody's included in that community engagement. And the GUTS team they do it very, very well.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Any other thoughts from the panelists?
I just wanted to kind of circle back and address this point about, working in communities that you don't necessarily identify with. And I just want to be intentional about not making this any harder than it needs to be. It's often fascinating to me how if people are doing research in a culture that's totally different from them. So if I was from the United States and I had to go and do some research in China, Japan, or India, or say even Israel, and I knew nothing about those cultures, people can form a really good idea of how to go out and do that research, and they can form it really quickly. But if I ask you to go and talk to, the Latino person down the street from you, or, the Black person who lives, a few towns over, it's always kind of a blank stare when it comes to how do you engage these people. And so I would say use the same tools. If I had to do a research study in Japan today and I knew nothing about the culture, well, first, I would probably educate myself about the culture so that when I'm engaging with people who are Japanese, I'm as respectful as I possibly can be. And then I would probably reach out to somebody in that culture who can be sort of a liaison. Maybe this is somebody who's doing the same work or working in the same area as me. And then using that person as a gatekeeper, to potentially engage other people in the culture and build out my, confidants or an advisory group. And then from there, building out my studies around not what I say or what I think, but out of the advisory group who speaks the language, who's involved in the culture, who's involved in these communities. And so we can build a study together that is culturally appropriate for the communities that I'm trying to serve, that is not like me. So all those same principles still apply to the Black people down the street, or the indigenous people in the tribe, not too far from you, or the Hispanic folks that live south of you. You know, all of these cultures may speak different languages than you. They may not identify in the ways that you identify. And that's even going to the LGBTQ community. You know, there may be a whole different cultural reference, but how you engage is in the same way. You educate yourself, you find somebody who speaks the language, you build meaningful partnerships that are not just about you getting what you want, but are about a mutual reciprocity with the community that you're trying to serve. And you go out and you do the work with the community as a true partner.
Can I say something to that?
Yes, go ahead, Wendy.
Oh, sorry, Jordan, go ahead. God, I didn't realize you came off mute.
No, you're fine. You know, I wanted to highlight a little bit of this piece because I could not agree more, right? Half of this is a Google search away. Saying it very bluntly. The other piece that I want to highlight in terms of this question of like what opportunity is before us or what things are working, I think it's a little bit of and both, right? So one is, yes, I am 100% in favor of allyship, but if anyone has ever talked to me, allyship is the last step on that train. Awareness is your first step, right? You can't solve a problem you don't fundamentally understand. And so one of the pieces to that, I think Lewis hit the nail on the head, is like, where do you start from a foundation of deep and profound knowledge and context around what is happening in these communities, right? Not as subjects, but a real lived, full view, a full scope of the dynamicism of those communities, right? The other piece that is critical for me, and this is a personal passion area because of the work, you know, my company and the work that we do, is right now, I think Dr. Gorm hit it on the head, right? We have folks who are like, well, we always have our PIs and they're always MDs. We don't have NP PIs, right? That is an active decision, as a systemic decision that we know is leading to disparate outcomes in terms of the patient populations that we're trying to reach. So when we talk about this question of allyship, I think it's incredible and we should absolutely learn about the communities we're a part of, but we should also leverage the scope of our power and influence in the areas we have them, because someone sitting on this webinar is engaged with the decisions of who they set as their study PIs. Similarly, someone on this call is making the decision about where they hold their clinical trials. And they're going to say, we're only going to hold them at places that have done this type of trial before. Well, the community centers, the federally qualified health centers that my company works with have not done them before. But the literal point of access is to give them the opportunity to do them, because they understand the nuances of communities that these other research centers fundamentally don't, because they're not there. That's not a shortcoming or anything. It's just the kind of facts of where we are in industry. And so I do want to take the opportunity to encourage people to grow their awareness so that they can leverage the scope of their influence to actively change the direction of something they're engaged with. Because what tends to happen is they do a ton of research on these communities and they feel like my connection with this community is on our Saturday volunteer hour, right? And then when I get in the office on Monday, I'm completely disconnected from the influence that I can have in these communities at my day-to-day, at my 9 to 5, or some of us 9 to 10 p.m., hopefully not, right? That I think that we have a really rich opportunity to leverage that influence.
Great points, Jordine, absolutely. And Wendy, you were going to add as well.
Yes, I want to add 2 points. One is just in terms of getting involved, just to add to what Jordine and Lewis said, we have to commit to be comfortable with being uncomfortable. Because many times people just, they're uncomfortable, so they take a step back, they don't know what to do, but get okay with that. And then take a step out there. And I think it's important that we connect with people. Mm-hmm. We communicate, we over communicate, but no one's really connecting. So like Lewis said, going to China, you want to connect with that person. It's a person, right? Regardless color, regardless socioeconomic status, regardless of religion, but connecting with the human being is very important. And then to Jordine's point, at J&J, we are exploring working with new institutions to maximize our recruitment of minority patients. So working with institutions that we usually don't work with. So that's an initiative we are currently exploring to really address the health inequities that exist in clinical trials. So I think we all have to look at what we're doing and how we can move the needle. What do we need to do different? And I think COVID-19 has done that. It has resurfaced things that have existed and pulled the veil back. And it's a great opportunity for us to take this time to shift. Shift. And you said, how do we, the boats and the tides, but how we do that is we hold people accountable. So like right now we're having this really great conversation, right? And there are many panels across the nation who are talking about this. But I think in order to move the needles, we need to be intentional about what steps we're going to take and then hold people accountable, right, to that. So that's what I just wanted to add to the conversation. Thank you.
And if I can add one other thing, Kimberly. So when you're talking about being bold and bodacious, I think you need to take a risk. And of what I've heard with all of my years of being with the National Black Nurses Association and working with the pharmaceutical industry, you all tell us that it takes 10 years to effectively bring a drug from creation to fruition, to the market. And if you can take 10 years as a bold risk on this drug getting to market to help save millions and millions of lives, I think you can take a bold risk in changing the needle, moving that needle to bring nurse practitioners in as principal investigators. Because the truth of the matter is you're going to need more providers and researchers in order to conduct the research. And it's not going to take you 10 years to produce that nurse practitioner. So we can go down that train rail together on both producing that drug and producing that nurse practitioner to become that principal investigator. That's my bold risk, and I'm sticking to it.
Yeah, thank you so much. Great points. I love it. And I guess a related question, which I do think is interesting, is around, and again, whether you see it this way or not would even be interesting to me. So there is this concept of a digital divide. So sometimes when we have conversations in this space, we talk about using tech. I know that Lewis also really advocated for the community engagement, which I think is fantastic. So when we talk about the technology or trying to use technology to reach underserved communities, do you feel like that's a worthwhile endeavor? I mean, it still seems like, I think it's 3 billion. Are there 3 billion cell phones on the planet? Or some crazy number? I think there's more cell phones than people, which is really interesting considering I grew up when, there weren't really that many cell phones. So I guess I just want to get your thoughts on this. Is a concept that's talked a little bit about in this space around a digital divide. Do you see that as an issue? Or would you say, again, in the spirit of what we just talked about, hey, try some things, maybe some tech-based things, maybe some community-based things, and see what works, and kind of to Dr. Gorham's point, take some risk. So I'd just be interested in each of you sharing a perspective on that piece. Lewis, you want to kick us off?
Sure. So I have a few thoughts on this, and I'd like to start off by talking about one of my classmates. I'm currently attending an online MPH program at a HBCU. And one of my classmates, a lot of these folks are from the South, like the deep South. And one of my classmates talked about, she's younger, she talked about how when she was in high school, she did not have a computer and she had to write her papers on a cell phone, a very, very old iPhone. To be exact. And so that really opened my eyes to the fact that we still do have a technology gap, especially in some of the places in the deeper South that we know are historically underserved by the medical community and underserved across the board, to be honest. So there is a digital divide. I think that when you talk about technology and how you use it to reach critical populations, you have to think about how you use this technology. So yeah, if you're looking for recruiting Black gay men, yes, maybe Jack the Grinder is the way to go, but also thinking about how you still do in-person outreach, how you still do community outreach, so that there's not just digital ads that represent you, but there is a real face in the community that represents you and your study and your company. And so that people have a sense of what's behind these ads, because I think that helps to engender trust in the community as well. And it helps to really ensure that you're doing work that goes beyond just, again, pulling people out of the community or pulling information or biomatter out of people for your own benefit. But it takes, as we talked about earlier, a real engagement that you humanize people and don't just turn them into subjects.
Absolutely. Wendy, yeah.
I just wanted to add, I think technology is an option or a solution. It's not the solution. So it has to be a multifactorial approach and how we do this. So one shoe does not fit all. So I think it's something we can consider, but it's not going to be the end all be all to this issue. And I just think we need to consider that.
There's
Yeah,
actually
no.
an audience question that's pretty relevant, and to me it links back to what you said earlier, which is about who's held accountable. And so it's saying in some ways technology can help to scale some of these aspects of what we're talking about, but who is, like, which stakeholders in the research ecosystem are meant to invest in this technology and really find out how it's most helpful? Is it pharma? Is it government, et cetera?
And I would say to that point, not to cut anyone off, but to that point, I think we have to really take a look and do some deep soul searching about responsibility in this matter. So if you are a multi-billion-dollar company doing research on communities that are economically disadvantaged in every way, just about every way possible, every way imaginable, and you're coming in to do a study that's being funded for millions upon millions and millions of dollars, then we really need to think about what is equity in this regard. What is financial equity in this regard? That you're going to have somebody come in and spend 2-3 hours with you and give them what, $50, $100? Like that to me doesn't make any sense. And so when I talk about community engagement, I'm talking about not just making connections with people. We're not just talking about building long-term, partnerships, but we're also talking about how can you infuse resources into these communities and in the opportunities that you have to make it more equitable for them to participate and for their betterment long-term. So, and maybe in that way, we will have more trust of these from communities to these companies, so that it's not seeming like that you're just pulling things out of the community that really has very little resources to begin with.
So you're talking about sustainable resources, long-term sustainable resources.
Yeah, I'm talking about money.
So I was just on a call on yesterday about Medicare Advantage. And one of the things that came up when you're talking about technology was older people, the Medicare population, having the ability to use technology in order to get healthcare services during COVID. So we're talking, again, about pulling back the veil. And part of that pulling back the veil said that here are older people who don't have laptops. They don't have tablets. They still are using flip cell phones that will not allow them to link up with their provider to get that telehealth visit, let alone participate in a clinical trial. And then the second part of that, when you're talking about rural communities, I was a lobbyist for the National Rural Health Association many moons ago. And one of the things that you find in rural communities, just like you were saying about in the Deep South, even if you're in the Deep South, you still may be in a city or a town. That's not rural. but you still don't have the bandwidth, the broad bandwidth in order to get the internet access that you need in order to get the healthcare services that you need, let alone participate in a clinical trial. And then the third part of that, when you're talking about bandwidth, even in the city, I was just on a call with the university and they talked about having students going back into the school system, into schools, and whether or not the university has enough bandwidth in order to take care of the 2 cell phones that the students have and the laptop that all the students have. So we're talking about the multiple bandwidth that comes with making sure that we can also get the healthcare services that we need through that broadband access. And I think that that's going to be more important the older, as we older people continue to need to use multiple services, including clinical trials.
All right, thank you, Dr. Gorham. That's good feedback from your call that you had yesterday as well. So I think we're coming up to the end of time, and I just want to give each of the panelists to kind of share some final thoughts. I think that you all have provided some really good insight into action and being action oriented. So happy for you to share any additional ideas that you have with the group here on how to continue to take action and be action oriented and be part of the change that we all wish to see in the world. And then we will wrap up by about 1 o'clock and still open it up if there's any final questions that the participants have as well. We're happy to answer those. So I'm going to go ahead and start. Jordine, do you mind kind of starting with your wrap up?
Sure. My wrap up is fairly simple. It's like, what is your scope and what is your impact? And so if you're sitting on the call today, whatever your industry is, you have the opportunity right now to engage with this topic voraciously. And what I mean by that is not just popping in at lunchtime, but really engaging with understanding how you can impact clinical trials and access to clinical research. And I'll give you one point of action that you can do right now is if you're working in a company now, we're talking about money. Thank you, Lewis. Ask what the budget is. How much are we spending? How much are we spending in the community, on community engagement or advocacy? Because that will, you'll start to pull a thread and uncover what this investment looks like across industry.
Thanks, Jordine. Wendy?
Yes, so I want to challenge everyone who's listening is really figure out what you're going to do next and commit to it. Start the conversation with family, friends, even your healthcare providers, I think is important, but make that commitment and take that next step today. And I just want to say, since we're talking about money, that, Johnson & Johnson, we committed to $150 million over the next 5 years to invest and promote health equities. And, we have 3 pillars that we're focusing on, which are people first, culture, enduring alliances, and healthier communities, since communities have been a big part of this discussion. And a couple of ways that we are allocating those funds is we're supporting the Career Development Awards for cancer health equity research for junior faculty members serving underserved communities, and developing a diversity clinical trials internal framework in efforts to improve clinical trial representation across all Janssen's therapeutic areas. So we are definitely trying to move the needle, and I love some of the suggestions that were put out here. So something I will definitely bring back. And accountability, like I said, right? I'll definitely bring back and talk to the team, because there were some great things discussed here today. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Wendy. Dr. Gorham?
Wendy, I'm going to follow up with your money with Lewis and Jordine. So I'm going to be bold enough to ask for pharma industry to make investments in internships for nurses and other healthcare providers as interns, to do some work around clinical trials and to do it the Johnson & Johnson way, the pharmaceutical way, so that they'll learn early on in their career path about what it means to be a clinical trials coordinator. And then the second part of that I'm boldly asking for are fellowships for nurse practitioners, for those who are master's prepared, nurse practitioners to become fellows as soon as they get out of school, and come work with the J&J team and work with other pharmaceutical companies so that they can learn more about how to become that principal investigator.
Thank you, Dr. Gorham. And Lewis.
First and foremost, I like to just remind people, especially companies, to invest in historically Black colleges if you're going to increase the pipeline of medical professionals. Our historically Black colleges still do immense amount of work in training and raising up a huge chunk of our Black medical professionals. So I just wanted to say that. The other thing I wanted to leave with us is just normalize seeing the populations that you work with in their full humanity. You know, as a Black man, it's not my job to teach you how to humanize me, but I shouldn't have to. You know, you humanize your family members, you humanize your friends every single day. And so if you can find a way to honor your grandmother, whether that person is dead or alive, we find ways to honor people and to humanize them and to celebrate them. And so I would encourage people to bring that same spirit to the populations that you serve in research or clinical trials or in your medical profession, that it's that same honor, that same sort of celebration of humanity of the person, the individual that you want to bring into those spaces as well.
Thank you, Lewis.
Great.
Alexandra, do we have any other questions from the
We
participants?
don't, not that I can see. So I can wrap it up, and thank you so much for spending the last hour with us. Thank you to our panelists, and thank you to Kimberly for moderating this great discussion. Please be on the lookout for a post-event follow-up from New Lab with a recorded video of today's event and a survey that helps us with future programming. It's always great to be a part of these. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.